I'd just like to welcome everyone here to the event from the Center on Global Energy Policy on Decoding Paris, where we'll be asking if the Paris climate negotiations will catalyze greater climate action. My name is Keith Benish. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and we're very excited to have this event for you today. We have a lineup of current negotiators, former negotiators, and longtime followers of the process to help inform us what we can expect in 2 weeks in Paris. And referencing Paris, obviously, along with everyone else, our thoughts go out to the people in Paris in light of the horrific acts of violence that occurred there last week. The most recent news reports are that the French government is still planning on going forward with the climate negotiations. I'm not sure there was ever any real question that they wouldn't do that. There are some reports that many side events and other events in Paris may be being canceled, so if people have plans, we'll all want to keep an eye on that. But with that, I will go ahead and open our event tonight. With us, we have Majid Al Suwaidi, Selwin Hart, Rueanna Haynes, and Professor Michael Gerrard, who I will give their proper due introductions when we come to them. But first, I just wanted to give a brief overview, reviewing where we are coming into Paris and what we can expect. So the good news as we come into Paris is that there are a lot of signs of positive progress on climate change. First among them is the fact that several key emitters, in particular China and the United States, along with traditionally the EU that's been in favor of taking mitigation, seem very committed to achieving an agreement in Paris. And this has not always been the case of these key players. So this is part of the unprecedented actions setting the stage for the conference, the bilateral announcements between the US and China, China and the EU, the US and India have made bilateral announcements, the US and Brazil, and the Secretary General and other UN agencies have been engaging in a lot of outside activities beyond the negotiations, where they'll be trying to land a lot of other initiatives to catalyze additional action beyond just the negotiated agreement there. The biggest thing that has gone on this year, in addition to the negotiations trying to put together the text of the agreement, is that 131 INDCs have been submitted. These are the intended nationally determined contributions. These primarily outline the mitigation actions that countries intend to take to reduce emissions, but they also cover other issues such as adaptation, climate finance, loss and damage. These INDCs cover 153 countries. They account for over 90% of current global emissions come from countries that have submitted an INDC. And more interesting, INDCs covering about 70% of global emissions include commitments that essentially mean that those countries intend to decouple emissions growth from economic growth. And what I mean by this is we have INDCs from representing 70% of global emissions from countries that intend to peak their emissions and begin declining sometime before 2030 or already have peaked their emissions. And this is one of the big conversations that has gone on leading into Paris, is this question of whether or not the INDCs and the mitigation commitments within them will be internationally legally binding or not. And the figure that I have up there now just shows the sort of progress that we've had over the last decade, where the international community has had to forego getting internationally legally binding emissions commitments of the sort that were in the Kyoto Protocol. But what we have gained is this much greater coverage of global emissions from these non-legally binding targets. It remains to be seen whether or not this is the right trade-off for countries to have made, and I think that it's not an entirely settled issue in terms of the negotiations that the mitigation commitments themselves won't be legally binding, and that might be one of the things we talk about today. But it is difficult to see an agreement achieved with legally binding commitments that actually includes the United States among some of the other countries that have made these commitments. But the good news is that we are now up to nearly 3/4 of global emissions covered by these INDCs from countries who have expressed this intent to, achieve a downward trajectory in emissions over the next 15 years. But of course, there's some bad news also. We're still not on a pathway to 2 degrees. I think the most recent analyses of the INDC submitted have something in the range of 2.7 to perhaps a little over 3 degrees Celsius by 2100 estimated global increase. Recent updates in the emission statistics or in the coal consumption statistics from China show that there had been a significant underreporting of the amount of coal consumption, which amounts to, I think the statistic I saw was that if you add the additional coal consumption that China has apparently had coming over the years, it's like adding another Germany worth of emissions to global emissions. There's uncertainty about the U.S. and its climate actions. If we are undertaking climate actions in the United States under executive authority, what happens when there's a change in president in 2016, and particularly if there's a change in political party in charge of the White House. There are also challenges, even if we were to achieve a 2-degree pathway, there's still significant issues in addressing adaptation and in addressing loss and damage. And in all of these issues, we need more climate finance in terms of both money going towards climate smart technologies and money flowing from developed to developing countries, or as a former US negotiator, from developed and some developing countries to developing countries to promote this climate smart growth. With that, I'll just give a brief overview of a research project that we have undergoing at the Center on Global Energy Policy to get at this question of climate finance, and in particular the behavior of private investors and whether or not private investors are influenced by these sorts of big multilateral negotiations at the UN. We are surveying a group of 50 to 100 investors in the energy space from around the world, asking questions about what's most important in their investment decisions in terms of investing in clean energy technologies or other climate finance. Is it national climate policies? Is it international actions? Is it other policies about developing domestic infrastructure in countries? Is it other market factors? Interesting, some of the initial results that we have back that we thought were particularly interesting is first that the international agreements rated as much more important to investors than I would have predicted coming into this. They generally come in just behind the sort of direct policies about climate or energy investments in country and ahead of many of these other things. And among the international outcomes, the other interesting thing is that leading the way fairly clearly is developing a transparent and accountable framework in the global system that would be a place where countries have to come and present on what their domestic climate policies are and how they're implementing them. And that came in ahead of countries actually making emissions reduction commitments in terms of importance to investors, and seems to be leading in terms of the direct pledges about mobilizing public finance or on a general long-term emissions goal. And so this brings us to the question that we will have our panelists talk to, which is what are the remaining issues? And I've outlined a few of them here. It's that question of what will that transparency system be for the INDCs, for the mitigation commitments, and also for the adaptation and other commitments. How will we resolve climate finance? Will countries come up with specific dollar amounts that they commit to mobilize, or will there be some other formulation for that? Loss and damage is a very difficult issue that needs to be addressed in the agreement. Adaptation, there's always the question in the politics of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change of the differentiation between Annex 1 countries, which are developed countries from 1992, versus the non-Annex 1 countries. I have some of the other ones there, including whether or not the INDCs would be legally binding. And there are also, as I mentioned, these many outside initiatives that we will also be addressing here, and whether or not they can help move the needle on greater climate action. And to frame that, one of the initial questions I'm going to ask our panelists, particularly the former negotiators, is, right, we have the issues that are remaining. I want us to talk about that. I would also like you all to predict what issue might be the one or two that only gets resolved in the final huddle. And hopefully we don't need a final huddle. If people don't know what this is, at many of the COPs, the Conference of Parties, it's come down to the day or maybe 2 days after it was supposed to end, after several all-nighters, the last sticky issues. It ends up with representatives from the countries, usually the largest countries or the largest emitters, who are in a group on the floor, like just hammering out whatever that last detail is. This particular photo is from the Durban conference at COP17. And this is precisely where they came up with the term an agreed outcome with legal force. For people that don't recall, the Durban outcome that kicked off these negotiations said that they would undertake no later than 2015 to negotiate a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force. And it was basically this group of negotiators sitting there throwing words back at each other of, can everybody accept this term as an additional thing that we can agree to? They settled on an agreed outcome with legal force for a variety of reasons, in part because it had enough ambiguity that lots of people could go home to their various countries and say it meant completely different things. So with that, I would like to turn and begin with Majid Al Suwaidi. Majid is the lead climate negotiator for the United Arab Emirates and an advisor on issues related to sustainable energy and sustainable development. He has extensive experience in international negotiations and leads the mission's engagement at the Second Committee Matters in the United Nations, which covers a wide range of issues relating to economic growth, development, financing for development, sustainable development, human settlements, poverty eradication, globalization, and interdependence. Since 2012, Majid has been the Climate Change and Natural Resources Manager of the Directorate of Energy and Climate Change at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has covered the UNFCCC negotiations as well as clean energy ministerial, habitat, aviation, and technology issues. Before coming to work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Majid had worked as a reservoir geologist at ADNOC, one of the national oil companies. And so he has a lot of experience on all sides of the energy issues. And with that, Majid, I'll invite you to speak a bit about the upcoming negotiations.
Thanks very much, Keith. And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight and for giving me this opportunity to speak. As Keith mentioned, I used to be a geologist at an oil company, so for me these are quite interesting discussions. And one of the things that I thought would be important to just mention today is with a lot of these discussions, how you view negotiations can depend on your perspective. In that vein, I thought it was important perhaps to talk a little bit about the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and our position in the negotiations. Many people don't know that, or do know that we are an oil-producing country, one of the largest oil-producing countries in the world. But what many people don't know is that we're also a country that's very interested in sustainable development, particularly in addressing climate change, and attempting to be a progressive country in the negotiations. Our leadership many years ago, in fact, from the founding of our country, recognized that responsible environmental stewardship is very important, and takes the issue of climate change very seriously. We have a green growth strategy as part of our development strategy for the country, and we have climate change as at the core of all our decision making when it comes to development policy in the country. And so we have a number of initiatives to help tackle or address climate change. On the other hand, we're also a very small country in the Middle East, and for that reason we recognize that it's imperative that we have a multilateral agreement for any action to be successful. Our emissions account for less than 1% of global emissions, and yet as a country in an arid environment we will be deeply affected by the effects of climate change. And so it's very important that we see a global reaction to the issue of climate change. So that's where we come to these negotiations from that perspective that we alone as a country can't really make a difference to the global emissions problem. But that we can work together with other countries to try and find solutions that are practical and ones that can work for all countries. And also taking the perspective that all countries are different. And so a small country like ours can take a leadership role in certain aspects. And for instance, we are very engaged in renewable energy technologies. Some of you may have heard of Masdar, which is our renewable energy project, both a city that is intended to be carbon neutral, but also a company that provides renewable energy investment at home, but also abroad, and is invested in London Array and other projects. But then there's also a research and development component in Masdar Institute that looks at renewable energy. So we really come to the issue through renewable energy, through energy efficiency, particularly because our emissions at home are related to energy. We have to produce a lot of cooling because it's an arid environment, but also we're dependent on desalination, which is converting salt water to fresh water or drinkable water. So that takes a lot of energy and power as well. So tackling our emissions is around energy. But for many other countries, it's going to be different types of actions that they'll have to take. So for us, an agreement in Paris has to recognize the differences that countries take to addressing climate change, but also is legal in its nature, so it has some legal force. I think Keith's question was about what are those key issues that we see being those final problematic issues. From our perspective, the key issue is going to be differentiation. So as I mentioned, we recognize that different countries have different approaches. So what is the differing responsibility? And some of you who are familiar with the negotiations may be aware of the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. And perhaps that's something we might discuss later. But this idea that different countries have different responsibility, that can be wrapped up in issues of historic responsibility, and the responsibility of industrialized nations to take a leadership role, the responsibility of wealthy nations to take a role, but then also the different responsibility for poor nations who may be able to take actions but with help or support from others, or have different responsibilities. As a country like ours, we're taking a leadership role, but we're a very young country. We're a country that's 44 years old and only have made a very minor, if any, contribution to the problem. But a country that's still coming to the table, that's interested to participate in the solution. So that would be the first issue that we would see. The legal form of the agreement is going to be important. Keith mentioned that it's still to be determined exactly what an agreed outcome with legal force means. And one thing that I think it's important to think about, and is a subtlety that I was discussing with our team today, there's a difference when you look at this in terms of the agreement that will be signed in Paris, and then the decisions that will be taken under the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties. And this is something that's very hard to explain to the media or the general public, but the difference between the two is quite important. So we can have agreement that can have one type of legal force, but then we can make decisions that we as parties are going to take actions that may have different legal form or may have a different level of, I don't want to say importance, because they may even be more important than the agreement themselves. So that could be, you may agree as parties to take certain actions that will be quite ambitious, even more ambitious than the agreement itself might be. So thinking about that is quite important and something that will be part of the discussion in Paris. Ambition is really important, and there are those countries who think that it's really important that we set high ambitious goals that will guide the decision making and will give us that benchmark against which we can judge our performance. As a country as the UAE, we tend to think about things in terms of key performance indicators nationally. So every 5 years we set these performance indicators to try and improve every year. And we have a strategy by 2021 to be within the top 5 countries in the world across all metrics. So we set these key performance indicators to try and measure how we're doing in that. So that's how we come towards these negotiations. But of course, other countries have different approaches to development. The US, for instance, has a very different approach to how it tackles these issues. Setting ambitious target would be something that would from some parties' views, would drive ambition, would drive action. For others, they might have a different view on that. And then finally, I think that the last key component will be finance in a post-2020 world. So many developed countries have committed to 100 billion annually by 2020, but what happens after 2020 and how finance is provided is going to be a very important question. This is particularly important because the regime we're moving to is one where everybody will be participating. Yet we know that many countries, those poor countries, have a priority to ensuring that they tackle poverty first. And so for them to be able to take ambitious climate change actions, they need to have the resources or the finances to help them to make those decisions. In some cases, we would argue that those decisions are economical and it makes sense for those countries to make those choices. But in other circumstances, it might be cheaper, for instance, to put in place a coal power plant than it is to put in place a concentrated solar plant. And for those countries to be able to make that decision that we would prefer, they need to have the financial support. And therefore, it's very important that we see that finance is provided. And a big part of that is also how do we mobilize private sector finance? So how do we incentivize the private sector to provide the investment or to create the investment environments that encourage those clean technologies or encourage the policies to be put in place that help reduce emissions? So those will be the sort of key issues at the very end. I think the question of what will be the issue at the final huddle is one that I won't hazard a guess at. I've been to a number of these negotiations and I'm always surprised at what the issue is at the very final huddle. And sometimes it can be a few, so one can unlock the other. I think in the case of these negotiations, the question of differentiation will unlock many of the problematic areas and might be the one that comes down to the line. So those would be some of my thoughts on the issue, but I hope we can have an interesting conversation about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Majid, and thank you for getting us started on that. I had one follow-up question for you. You talked about ambition and the importance of that, and for again, as the background for people who aren't steeped in the language of the UNFCCC, the sort of ambition discussion is generally shorthand for talking about how ambitious are the pledges or the targets in terms of reducing emissions. As I mentioned, the INDCs are in. These contain the mitigation commitments that countries are prepared to make. We know we're short of the globally agreed 2-degree goal. There's not much prospect of there's not any prospect of making revisions to the INDCs in Paris. So how do we address that ambition? You talked about, for the UAE, of having performance indicators and a 5-year review process that you all will go through. I guess I don't necessarily want to ask you what the right way to do it is, but what is the discussion around that in the UNFCCC for the sort of what kind of system there might be for reviewing the INDCs over time and strengthening them going through into 2020? Where are the party positions on those?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's an excellent question in the sense that it's one that we've been grappling with for 4 years now, is how do you ratchet up ambition over time? And so, again, each country comes with a different approach. And for many countries, certainly for the UAE, committing to something that you can't achieve psychologically is very difficult. So you will put in place a target that you're pretty sure or you're 99% sure that you're going to achieve, and you hope to surpass that. So that's the approach that the UAE would take. Other countries might take a different approach. So they would take one where they would set a really ambitious target, not expecting to make it, but hoping to drive ambition or to drive, for instance, the private sector or people innovators to innovate. And so managing that is something that's really important, and particularly at this stage in terms of these are the intended nationally determined contributions. There's almost a different psychology because it's about building trust amongst the parties, trust that everybody's going to do something. So that was the intention. We were a big part of advocating for this nationally determined part of the pledges, if you will. And the reason for that is that we felt that if countries could come forward with what they felt confident they could do, then we could have a conversation, well, how are we falling short? And we could have a frank conversation about how do we fill the gap? Do we do that through mobilizing the private sector? Do we do that through developed countries or wealthy countries taking a lead, taking that extra step that could be your differentiation, and or what other forms are there to make it. But at least everybody's participating, everybody's taking part, and then we can sort of, over time, drive ambition, so try to reach our goal. For us, how often you review is not as important as the fact that everybody's coming forward and that we are able to review and think about how to set those new targets going forward. In many ways, it's a test of faith, if you will, but it seems to be the only way that it works for everybody, because no country at this stage is willing for others from the outside to tell them what they should or shouldn't do. But if you use a sort of a carrot scenario where everybody is incentivized because they want to be part of the solution, then the hope is that you will drive ambition that way, and people will come forward with more ambitious targets every time. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, we will now move to Rueanna Haynes. Ms. Haynes is an attorney by training and has been with the Permanent Mission of Trinidad and Tobago at the United Nations since 2010. Her primary area of responsibility has been the Second Committee of the UN General Assembly, and she was intimately involved in negotiations on Rio Plus 20, the Third International Conference on Small Island Developing States, the Open Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Third International Conference on Financing for Development, and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. During her time at the mission, Ms. Haynes has also worked on issues within the First and Sixth Committees of the UN General Assembly. In addition to her duties at the mission, Ms. Haynes has worked on the climate change issues and has been involved in the negotiations at the UNFCCC since 2009. At present, she is co-chairperson of the Compliance Committee of the Kyoto Protocol, as she holds the position of chairperson of the Enforcement Branch until December 2015. With that, Rueanna, if you could go ahead and present us your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, and good night to everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity to sit and have a conversation with the number of interested parties I see here in the room. This is obviously a very topical issue right now, but it's also usually one that really is only able to capture the imagination of the general public in sort of a tangential type of way. So I'm really happy to be here to try to dig into some of the issues a bit more substantively. I'm going to add one thing to what Keith said and just say that I am not here in my official capacity. So you can consider me just a very highly informed, concerned citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, as far as it relates to the discussions on these issues. I'm glad that you let Majid lead off, Keith. I think he's done a lot in terms of laying the foundation for the discussion here. I don't really have much to add in terms of what Majid has said on what the big issues are. Since this is a law school, maybe I will add something in terms of how we might analyze these issues from a slightly more academic perspective. So in terms of the big issues that have been laid out, we could also separate them into two categories. Those that are substantive and relate to the substance of what goes into the agreement, and those related to form. Now, I'm saying this just for the purpose of analysis, because in fact, when you're involved in the negotiations, you find that there's almost no difference between substance and form in terms of how very contentious the discussions can become. In 2010 in Cancun, I think we spent several hours, and Selwin can attest to this as well, we spent several hours locked in many dark rooms trying to decide whether we will discuss substance first or form first in the context of those negotiations which predated the Durban mandate that we have for the new agreement that we're hoping to get from Paris. So on substance, I would say we have the following issues. The long-term temperature goal. And I know that Majid touched on this in terms of ambition, but I want to add a little bit more depth on it. And Majid is right in saying, depending on the country that you come from, it shapes your view of the negotiations. So as a highly informed, concerned citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, and not a climate negotiator, for some background, Trinidad and Tobago is a small island developing state, highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, in particular as it relates to, of course, sea level rise, but as well as how climate change is expected to affect vulnerable ecosystems such as coral reefs, as well as the agriculture sector in particular in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, we're in a bit of an interesting position because like the UAE, Trinidad and Tobago is also a very large exporter of oil and natural gas, more so natural gas. We also have one of the largest, I think the largest methanol plant in the world. And we deal with a number of downstream industries. So we are actually a small island developing state, vulnerable, highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, which is at the same time also involved in some high emitting areas for our economic stability. So it gives us, I want to say, a bit of a unique perspective because even at the national level, we are involved very strongly in trying to balance competing priorities. So the protection of the environment and our own survival as a nation down the line, of course, in the very long term, which competes with our desire to be obviously a responsible member of the international community, which competes with other short-term goals and objectives. I will say, however, that over time, we have developed a climate change strategy which is being introduced into national development plans across the board, and the government has recognized that our priority at this time would be addressing the climate change challenge because, of course, as we're all aware, oil and natural gas are all finite resources. In fact, I think they project for us that we'll be out of natural gas in the next 10 years. And so our imperative right now is diversification into other areas, which would include reliance on ecosystem services because it's an archipelagic state, but mainly two islands, Trinidad and Tobago. And in Tobago, they're very dependent on tourism, specifically ecotourism, which would depend on a number of ecosystem services. So this is the background of a SIDS. That's the acronym for Small Island Developing States in the negotiations. So for us, one of the main and key priorities is this long-term temperature goal. And you're not hearing a lot of discussion about this, mainly, I think, because it's largely a priority for SIDS and other highly vulnerable countries, such as the least developed countries, as well as a number of African states. Our preferred position is that we should not be looking at a 2 degree, and I heard you say 2 degree, Keith. We agreed below 2 degrees, correction.
Yes,
below, a below 2 degree. We shouldn't be looking at a below 2 degree long-term temperature goal, but actually a 1.5 degree goal. And there are a number of scientific studies which support this right now. In fact, since 2013, we've been involved in a process called the Review of the Long-Term Global Goal, which is looking at the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. We've analyzed over the course of 2 years the difference in those impacts at the global level, at the regional levels. And now there is a report called the Structured Expert Dialogue, which is basically a synthesis of all of the analysis that we've done over those 2 years, including the analysis that is made available in the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what it tells us is two important things. The first one is that this notion that once we get to 2 degrees Celsius, because as Keith rightly pointed out, right now we're on a path to maybe 3 or 4, maybe even 5. This notion that once we get to 2 degrees Celsius, it means we're all safe and we're all off the hook is, quite frankly, baloney. In particular, for those very vulnerable countries, what we have seen and what even the fifth assessment report of the IPCC shows is that even at 2 degrees, the risks for vulnerable ecosystems in small island developing states in particular, as well as some countries in Africa, as well as in some LDCs, the risk for those countries at 2 degrees is extremely high. For those countries with a 2-degree increase in average global temperatures, adaptive capacity is exhausted. For example, coral reefs will cease to exist. By contrast, with a 1.5 degree warming, we have the chance to save 50% of coral reefs. That's a huge difference for those countries that rely on these systems to protect their coastlines from sea level rise, and also for various ecosystem services, for example, as it relates to tourism and fish stocks as well. So, and this is just one example. So, as a SIDS, one of our key asks for Paris will be a long-term temperature goal to limit the increase in average global temperatures to below, well below 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees Celsius. Reaching to 1.5 degrees Celsius, I should say. Now, how is this issue being discussed? That's the next question. We have a number of options on the table. Some have put forward the notion of decarbonization. Others are speaking about climate neutrality. Others are speaking about carbon neutrality. And all of these terms mean different things, but they are not all mutually exclusive. And because this is one of those issues that will have major knock-on effects on other areas in the agreement, such as finance, because then we have to discuss how much finance are we speaking about if we're speaking not about 2, but 1.5. The discussion on burden sharing and common but differentiated responsibilities, as well as other discussions relating to transparency, reporting, accounting, and compliance. They're all wrapped up into this notion of what is the objective we are going to set for this agreement. What will be our long-term global goal, our long-term temperature goal? So I think I would prioritize that as one of the number one issues. In terms of substance, related to all of the other issues that Majid has outlined. In terms of form, we get on to the issues concerning legally binding nature of the agreement. And Majid touched on this as well, the relationship between the legally binding agreement as opposed to the decisions that the conference of the parties will take. And there's another layer to this, because within the framework of a legally binding agreement, we can have provisions which are more or less legally binding. And I'm assuming most of you may be law students, so you understand what it means when we talk about language that gives a more or less legally binding effect. And there's a fourth and last layer to that as it relates to which commitments are we discussing? Are we discussing legally binding commitments on mitigation, adaptation, finance, transparency, or, according to the US, on none of the above except transparency, for example? So I wanted to give that perspective on the discussion between the difference between what we will be deciding on substantively and what we will be dealing with in terms of form. And I'll add one last thing. I think this notion that there has to be a trade-off between the level of ambition and participation in the discussions is a false dichotomy. For those countries who are most vulnerable to climate change, it really makes no sense to say, let's all get into a sinking ship where our collective ambition will lead us to 4 degrees Celsius. But it's okay, because we'll all do it together. So I'll conclude my remarks there.
Thank you very much, Rueanna. And we will go to Professor Gerrard next to expand a little more on the what you were talking about, the legal form. But I did want to follow up on just one thing that you know, as you were talking about one of the main negotiating goals being that recognition of the 1.5 degrees as a more appropriate global goal. First, to emphasize that point, or to back up on it, 6 or 7 months ago, I was having a conversation with another negotiator from another island state, and they were talking about how they had wanted to put together on their foreign ministry website a sort of a map of the island, and as the INDCs come in, showing sea level in 2050. And as the INDCs came in from different countries of the mitigation commitment, they could show getting a little more coastline back and restoring. And they went to their science advisors and said, hey, we'd like to put this together. Can you do the modeling on this? And the advisor said, sure, we can do that, but it's just going to be water in all of those. In 2050, there was no prospect of, even if we got to a 2-degree goal, that at that time the most likely scenario was just about the entire country being inundated. So it is a very real issue to address. On the other hand, at the emissions, at current emissions, cumulative, we're already without, unless we come up with technology at large scale to be pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, it's very difficult to imagine achieving that long-term trajectory at 1.5 degrees. And so not as a negotiator, but as an informed citizen, it must be very difficult to figure out striking that balance in the negotiations, or observing, or trying to figure out how much do you keep pushing on these issues, representing states that traditionally, by typical measures in terms of power, economic or military on the globe, are not your major players. Like, how do you play that out in this sort of multilateral negotiation?
Thanks for that, Keith. And you're right. It's really difficult to get anything you ask for when you come from a country that is seen as having nothing to give. You're not a big player like the Brazils, Indias, Chinas, South Africa, who everybody wants something from them. There's almost nothing anybody wants from us, except perhaps to get us to shut up. So I would say that's how you play this, and that's how we play this. Through advocacy and through coalition building. We do have a lot of key asks that are absolutely imperative for us to achieve with this agreement, whether it's in a longer term or a medium term perspective. But as we all know how this goes, we lay these things out in packages, and we assign different levels of importance to different issues. Of course, this is one of our number one issues, but we will have to look at what emerges, I think, across the board before we can see where any compromise, if any compromise, would be possible. For example, even if we agree a very ambitious long-term temperature goal, if we have very poor arrangements in relation to transparency, reporting, and accounting, then there is no way that we would be able to track to know whether we achieve that goal. And so then it makes the agreement on a long-term goal null and void. Similarly, we can agree very strong arrangements on transparency, reporting, and accounting, but then we don't have a process in place to ensure that parties can come to the table regularly enough, which means every 5 years, in order to make sure that we achieve that deviation from business as usual in enough time to make a difference, because we are bound by time. Lastly, I just want to touch on one of the other issues that's very intimately linked with the long-term global goal, and that's the issue of loss and damage, which is another key issue, I think, in the discussions, which I think will definitely come down to the final huddle. It will be one of those issues, because small island developing states, LDCs, African countries, in fact, all developing countries now support arrangements for institutional arrangements to address the issue of permanent loss and damage within the context of the new agreement. And there are a number of developed countries that are dead set against this at varying degrees. I would say the US is probably the most antagonistic towards this position, but still willing to come to the table and discuss it. And what loss and damage is really meant to address is exactly what Keith was talking about. Even now, we have seen, well, to my mind, it's 0.85 increase in average global temperatures, but somebody told me the other day, actually, it's already 1 degree. And so we are already committed to a certain level of permanent loss of vulnerable ecosystems, permanent loss of coastlines, permanent loss of infrastructure. And if we're going into an agreement, presumably to begin in 2020, this loss and damage will continue. The extreme weather events will become increasingly severe. The agreement from Paris would not be credible unless arrangements are put in place to address this issue. So that's where we're coming from on that, but I'm hoping we can have more discussion on that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Rueanna. And again, my name is Keith Benish, here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, discussing the upcoming climate negotiations in Paris. And next we will go to Professor Michael Gerrard. Professor Gerrard is the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School, where he teaches courses on environmental and energy law and directs the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. He's also chair of the faculty of Columbia's Earth Institute. Before joining the Columbia faculty in 2009, he was partner in charge of Arnold and Porter's New York office. He practiced environmental law in New York City full-time from 1979 to 2008 and tried numerous cases and argued many appeals in federal and state courts and administrative tribunals. He formerly chaired the American Bar Association's 10,000-member section on environment, energy, and resources. He has served as a member of the executive committees of the boards of the Environmental Law Institute and the American College of Environmental Lawyers. Professor Gerrard is author of or editor of 11 books, 2 of which have been named the best law book of the year by the Association of American Publishers. His most recent book is Global Climate Change in U.S. Law, the 2014 edition, which is an absolutely invaluable resource for anyone who wants to understand more about the U.S. approach to climate change law. So with that, Professor Gerrard.
Thank you, Keith. And let me point out for the people standing in back, there are a few seats in front if any of you want to come down and occupy them. So Keith has asked me to talk about the legally binding nature of the agreement and what might be achievable in Paris on that front. So Article 2 of the United States Constitution says that before the U.S. may enter into any treaty, it requires a 2/3 vote of the United States Senate. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992 did achieve ratification by a 2/3 vote of the Senate. It was supported by President George H.W. Bush. We know that because of the current state of U.S. politics, getting 2/3 support for anything positive about climate is impossible for the foreseeable future. There is also the possibility, in theory, of the U.S. entering into binding international agreements under something called a Congressional Executive Agreement, which would require a simple majority of the House and a simple majority of the Senate and the signature of the President. But we know that that, too, is not achievable given the current composition of the House and the Senate. So the UN Framework Convention did contain provisions on monitoring and reporting. So the U.S. has already bound itself to undertake those activities, and I think that the U.S. could bind itself at Paris to undertaking certain monitoring and reporting and verification kind of requirements because they already have the treaty authority to do that under the 1992 convention. I don't see how the U.S. could commit in a legally binding way to emissions reductions. There were specific, no emissions reductions specifics were included in the 1992 agreement. I guess one could imagine an agreement coming out of Paris that separates the countries, those that are willing to be bound by both monitoring and reporting requirements and emissions reductions in one annex, and maybe those that are willing to be bound to the monitoring and emissions reduction, but not monitoring and reporting but not emissions reductions in another annex, that kind of thing is imaginable, but it's hard to think of an agreement that the U.S. would wholly sign on to that would commit to emissions reductions. The next question is, does it matter? I mean, the Kyoto Protocol was nominally legally binding, and of course that's one of the reasons why the U.S. never signed it, that the U.S. was not willing to sign on to mandatory emissions reductions commitments when the rapidly developing countries were not signed on to that. But it was legally binding on other countries in theory, and we know that Canada had emissions greatly in excess of its Kyoto commitments. Canada then withdrew from Kyoto, as the agreement allowed it to do, and nothing bad happened to it. There were no sanctions imposed on Kyoto. The Framework Convention on Climate Change does not have an army. It doesn't have the ability to enforce these legally binding commitments. Unlike the WTO agreements, it doesn't. The Kyoto Protocol did not have meaningful sanctions for violations, and it's not clear that meaningful sanctions would be attached to the Paris Agreement, even if it were nominally legally binding. So the legally binding nature of an agreement in this context has only limited effect. It doesn't mean that if a country violates this, that somebody can go to court or some other tribunal, and that tribunal would have the ability to enforce a judgment. And so all of this really comes down to domestic politics. It's the domestic politics in the U.S. that are holding the U.S. back from undertaking the sorts of commitments that I and many others think that it should. But that is the unfortunate reality. Let me just say one word about a couple of other techniques on ambition and legally things that are legally binding. There have been some very interesting lawsuits that have actually made some progress in the last year. A Dutch organization called the Urgenda Foundation and 900 Dutch citizens joined together and brought a lawsuit against the Kingdom of the Netherlands in the domestic courts of the Netherlands. They presented scientific evidence that the Dutch government's ambition, its pledges as part of the European Union's INDC, were not sufficient to stay on a 2-degree target. And they brought up a number of arguments under international human rights law, under the UN Climate Convention, under the Constitution of the Netherlands, and various other things. And they won at the trial court, and the court ordered the Dutch state to increase the level of ambition from its 17% pledge to a 25% pledge, primarily based on the court's finding that the duty of care of the Dutch state required that level of ambition. Now, that decision has been appealed. There was actually a debate in the Dutch parliament about whether to appeal it, and the decision was made to appeal it. But it's very interesting to watch that. And let me just take the liberty of mentioning that the lawyer who is mostly behind that case, a fellow named Roger Cox, is here at Columbia this Thursday and is giving a talk at 12:15 p.m. in room 103 in this building. So if any of you are interested in learning more about that case, Roger Cox will be here Thursday at 12:15 p.m. A comparable lawsuit was also brought in Pakistan against the government of Pakistan by a farmer, a citizen of Pakistan, saying that the government was not carrying out its own climate policy, and they won. The farmer won that case. A court in Lahore found that the government of Pakistan was not adequately preparing for climate change. This was more about adaptation than it was about mitigation. And the court formed a climate commission and named its members and gave it the job of figuring out how Pakistan should carry out its policy. So these are very interesting developments. I don't see that happening in the U.S. because the way the U.S. courts interpret the separation of powers and the relative role of the courts and the executive. But I think these are very interesting developments to watch.
Thank you very much, Professor Gerrard. And I will follow up with you with a question to play off of those. If we don't have those internationally legally binding commitments, perhaps it becomes even more important for people to understand sort of means of implementation. Well, that has a particular meaning in the climate negotiation context. So the way that countries implement these INDCs and the commitments they have, one of the key policies or regulatory initiatives underpinning the U.S. INDC is the Clean Power Plan that the EPA promulgated earlier this year. So you've demonstrated with your knowledge of these international cases, also follow all of these different litigations. And I was wondering if you could give us just a bit of an overview perhaps of what the path is, just from a procedural sense. How long does that take to resolve these sorts of court challenges? And if you want to make a prediction about how it comes out or what the key issue is in the challenges to that regulation.
So the Clean Power Plan, of course, is the EPA regulation aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired power plants, which are the largest source of greenhouse gases in the United States. And under the Clean Air Act, which is the authority for it, EPA cannot impose its requirements directly on emitters. Instead, each state has to have the opportunity to come up with its own plan. And if a state does not come up with a satisfactory plan, EPA can step in and impose a plan. This plan was officially published in the Federal Register about 3 weeks ago. Within hours, a total of, I think it's 21 lawsuits were filed against it. A total of 24 states have joined in the opposition to the plan. Something like 21 have come out on the other side. All these cases were filed on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, where by statute they have to go. The next major step will be the motion for a stay. The plaintiffs, the people who are opposing the regulation, are asking the Court of Appeals to issue an order saying that there is enough of a chance that the plan will be thrown out, that they want to block EPA from implementing it. The D.C. Circuit has issued a briefing schedule for the stay motion. The briefing schedule ends on December 23rd. So there will not be any stay before Paris because the briefing won't be done. It's likely that a stay decision would be made sometime, we don't know, February, March, April, something like that. And that's going to be a very important issue. If the stay is granted, then everything is likely to be on hold for a few years. If it is denied, then the states are going to have to go forward and prepare the plans, and we'll go through that whole process. When it gets to the merits of the case, one would expect that the D.C. Circuit would rule on that maybe the fall of 2016. We're not really sure. The Supreme Court there's a good chance that they will take it, but that we wouldn't expect to see a decision from the Supreme Court the way these things usually go until 2018 or 2019. So most of this is going to be well within the next presidency. And of course, depending on who is the next president of the United States, this could all go forward or it could stop. All the major candidates from one of the parties have declared that one of the very first things they would do on Inauguration Day is to halt the Clean Power Plan. And so if that happens, if that is the outcome of the election, then the U.S. stops these efforts. There will be a lot of litigation, but that would take years to resolve. So the most important decision that is going to be made in the next several years, I would argue, would be the outcome of the U.S. presidential election in 2016.
Thank you very much. With that, I will mention quickly that with the interesting comments that we've had from everyone and the bit of discussion we've had so far, we are well into our scheduled time. I will probably circumscribe any moderated discussion quite a bit. So very quickly after Selwin Hart gives his comments, we will move to take questions from the audience. That includes the audience online. And just to mention that you can tweet questions to us at Columbia U Energy, hashtag CGEP events. But before we do that, we'll first shift gears slightly to Selwin Hart. Mr. Hart is the director of the United Nations Secretary General's Climate Change Support Team. He has responsibility for providing overall supervision and guidance to the Secretary General's Climate Change Team on climate change-related issues relevant to the implementation of the SG's second-term 5-year action agenda. Prior to joining the United Nations, Mr. Hart served as the Climate Finance Advisor in the Office of the Vice President of the Caribbean Development Bank. Before that, he served as a Senior Foreign Service Officer in the Barbados Foreign Service and Counselor to the Permanent Mission of Barbados to the United Nations, where he was responsible for economic and financial affairs. He also served as the Chief Climate Change Negotiator for Barbados, as well as the Coordinator and Lead Negotiator on Finance for the Alliance of Small Island Developing States. He was a member of the Kyoto Protocol Adaptation Fund Board from 2009 to 2010 and was elected to the UN General Assembly to serve as Vice Chairman of the Second Committee of the UNGA. Mr. Hart holds a bachelor's degree of sciences in economics and accounting from University of West Indies, Barbados, and a master's of arts degrees in international political economy from Fordham University in New York. And Mr. Hart will brief us a bit on some of the other initiatives that hopefully culminate in Paris to kick off additional action on climate change organized by the Secretary General and others. Go ahead and Selwin.
Thanks a lot, Keith, and thanks for this invitation to join this distinguished panel. I know what your instructions were in terms of the issues that I should cover, but I think it's also useful for us to take a step back and see where we've come from. Most of us were in Copenhagen 6 years ago in 2009, when, in all honesty, the climate regime was probably at its lowest point. I honestly believe that there's much cause for optimism about the outcome in Paris. We're not completely there yet, you know, and I know that the islands and the LDCs and the vulnerable countries will have much to say about the outcome in Paris. But honestly, there is much cause for optimism. I believe the politics, the economics, and the science of climate change are much better aligned than they were 6 years ago, and probably more so than they ever have been over the last 20 years since the UNFCCC and the convention came to life. There was strong political will. I will first address the politics. There's much stronger political will to finalize an ambitious agreement in Paris. The joint announcements by the major powers, and Keith, you made reference to some of them earlier, have added significant political momentum to the formal negotiating process. The concept of universal application and participation in the climate regime is now firmly embedded in the DNA of the UNFCCC. Prior to the submission of the INDCs, countries were pointing fingers at who would do what first and what each other would do before taking action. Now you have, and you need to update your numbers, Keith, 161 countries representing 95% of global emissions have submitted their post-2020 climate plans or INDCs. This concept of universality is extremely important because it shows that we're all moving in the same direction. Obviously, the INDCs are not as ambitious as we would want, but it also sends a clear signal to markets, to investors and innovators that a low-carbon climate resilient future is inevitable, it is already underway, and it is beneficial to all. Developments in the real economy. The economic benefits of addressing climate change are now more widely accepted than they were 6 years ago. There's unprecedented mobilization around climate action in the private sector, in subnational governments, in cities, states, regions, all around the world, and also in the United States. While there might be this inertia in Washington, you're seeing lots of activity in many states and in many cities. Civil society is also fully engaged. At last year's climate summit in New York, the Secretary General mobilized actors around multi-stakeholder coalitions in sectors ranging from agriculture to transport, resilience, energy, and these coalitions have only grown from strength to strength. And in Paris, the Lima to Paris Action Agenda will be launched, and the Lima to Paris Action Agenda will have many of these coalitions making even more ambitious announcements. Now, the benefits of the Action Agenda, one of the main benefits of the Action Agenda is that it has given cover to many governments, even in countries with difficult domestic political situations, to be bold. If you know that your captains of industry, your major banks, financiers are supporting ambitious climate action, it has given many of these countries cover to be bold and to be ambitious. It has also helped to ensure that the right enabling environment at the domestic level is put in place. So you're seeing in many countries climate laws popping up. Since 2009, the number of jurisdictions covered by climate change laws has increased significantly. On the side of science, as Keith and Rueanna have both stated, the scientific imperative for action is much clearer than ever. With all that good news, we remain cautiously optimistic that there will be an ambitious agreement in Paris. However, there are a number of obstacles that have been identified by some of my colleagues. However, I don't believe that these obstacles are insurmountable. And I see them not only as challenges, but as potential opportunities. On the issue of differentiation, for example, it is quite clear that this new agreement, it will be an agreement that needs to address the needs of 193 different countries. And there is this evolving understanding that the new agreement needs to take into account the special circumstances and situations and levels of development of individual countries, but in a manner that does not undermine its effectiveness. Because at the end of the day, you need an agreement that is effective in the fight against climate change. But it has to be applied in a manner that takes into account the differing development levels of individual countries. So, for example, on transparency, there is an understanding that we will have a single system of transparency, but with embedded flexibilities to take into account countries with limited capacities. And those embedded flexibilities and the level and the devil will be in the details. Those embedded flexibilities could involve the frequency of reporting for certain countries. It could be the amount of information that some countries will have to submit. However, Paris must send a clear signal that we're all in this together. We're all bound by the same rules, but countries, given their different levels of development, will have the certain provisions of the new agreement will be applied in a flexible manner. On the issue of ambition, the NDCs are clearly not consistent with a below 2 degree goal, let alone 1.5. However, countries have expressed a clear willingness that Paris should not lock in a level of ambition that makes the below 2 degree goal improbable or impossible to achieve. There is this emerging consensus, or there is emerging consensus, that there will be a 5-year review, with the first review possibly occurring before the agreement enters into force, and that this review would set the stage, or stock take or review would look at how countries in aggregate are meeting the below 2 degree goal, and could inform any possible updating or review or submission of national contributions. I think that this would be an extremely important element that could address or help to address the ambition question that many of my colleagues have raised. Finally, on the issue of finance, Majid spoke about post-2020 finance. However, I believe pre-2020 finance, and this does not necessarily have to be part of the formal Paris agreement. It could be part of the other set of outcomes, but pre-2020 finance, how do you help countries before 2020 put the necessary plans in place and finance the infrastructure needed to ensure they can increase their level of ambition in a post-2020 world? And finance is key. Finance is key to de-risk the types of investment that will be required to move in a low-carbon direction and avoid technological lock-in that would place certain countries on a high-carbon development pathway. So while I see many, there are these challenges to an ambitious agreement in Paris, but I see them more as opportunities. And I am confident, or cautiously confident, or cautiously optimistic that countries will be able to overcome many of these differences and turn these differences into opportunities and finalize an agreement that is effective in the fight against climate change at the Paris conference in less than 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selwin. And as we are running short of time, I think I will go immediately, instead of a specific follow-up question, to see if there are questions from the audience. We have a microphone out somewhere to provide to people. And so if you could just state your name and affiliation and what the question
My
is.
name is Avneet. I work with the Executive Intelligence Review, and I wanted your comments because South Africa, about 2 weeks or a few weeks ago, said that this climate change draft by the United Nations is apartheid. This is racist. And South Africa said that on behalf of that nation and the main body, which is 130 developing countries and China, and which is in fact the truth, because this climate change deal is nothing but a genocide policy against developing countries. It is based on fraud. Man-made global warming is a fraud. carbon emissions is a fraud, and this will kill millions of people by denying them development, which is very necessary, very immediate. So I wanted your comments.
Thank you. I will put that to whichever panel member would like to take. I'll go to one of the negotiators, Majid or Rueanna.
Maj, you gonna take it?
Because I get the hard question, don't I? So I'm not aware of that particular quote, so I'm sorry I can't specifically answer that particular question. I think that for the UAE, we base our participation in the negotiations on science and the outcomes of the IPCC. I think the science, from my point of view, certainly as an individual, is quite clear on the issue. But I think that the question of how we tackle it is an important one, and one where the point about how developing countries can deal with this issue is quite important. Addressing climate change, and we've talked a lot about mitigation as part of the solution, but there's also the component of adaptation. And for a lot of countries, adaptation is going to be a significant issue, and something that I think that we forget to talk about a lot, because adaptation is something that's important for all of us. We had mentioned, I think earlier from Rueanna, about the impacts that climate change will have on agriculture, for instance, and food security. And this is something that really speaks to our issues as the UAE, is that increasing climatic instability will have dramatic impacts on food security. And as a country that imports a large proportion of our food, we have a collective interest in ensuring that agriculture is a topic that's addressed, an adaptation to a changing climate, be that man-made or non-man-made, is sort of unimportant. What is important is that we recognize that climate change is happening, and therefore we need to adapt. And that's a collective interest, because we all buy our food from an international market, and we're all affected by the price of food, and that's something that impacts us dramatically. So really, that is something that will harm poor people much more than wealthy people. And whether you think about it in terms of a sustainable development question, whether you think about it in terms of a climate change question, whether you think about it in just terms of a poverty eradication question, it's still the same outcome. You need to do something to adapt to a changing environment. So from my point of view, the question of poverty eradication is at the heart of this. And this is how we as a country look at it. It's about sustainable development. A component of that is climate change, but there are many other components. There's poverty eradication, there's development, there's economic diversification, there's many components. And I think that we've discussed climate change tonight, but there's the bigger topic of sustainable development, of course. And recently we had the announcement of the Sustainable Development Goals, where we've, and all of us, I think, were a part of that process, elaborated a set of goals to help to think about how we develop our countries sustainably and in a responsible manner. And I think thinking about it in that sense is certainly one way to look at it.
Yes, I think my mic is back on now. Just briefly, I think a few things. I think a distinction needs to be made between posturing in negotiations and an actual negotiating position. I cannot imagine that the statement that is alleged to have been made by South Africa was made on behalf of countries after countries would have sat and agreed on that kind of statement to be made. It sounds much more to me like posturing and the type of statement that would be thrown out there to create a particular type of environment going into negotiation, and it's something that is done fairly frequently by negotiators. So I think in the first place, a distinction needs to be made between how we approach discussions and create the effects that we would like and create the environment that we would like, and what is an actual negotiating position. From a developing country, addressing climate change is very much about human rights. It's very much about saving people from certain death and destruction. It is not about saving trees. It's not even about saving the planet, because guess what? The planet will go on. The question is whether we will be able to continue to live in the environment that we create on this planet in the next century or so. So let me paint you a picture. Imagine you live on a small island state, and in the past, you would have Category 2, Category 3 hurricanes that would come every year or so within a certain season. Each time one of them came, you'd lose a certain amount of infrastructure, people would die, homes would be destroyed. But it's a yearly occurrence, and you can put building codes in place, you can go to international banks and you can borrow money so that you can make better infrastructure to withstand the hurricanes that come every year at a certain time. You can prepare your people. Imagine if you live in a world where these events happen much more frequently, every few months. There is no particular season. You have no idea when it is going to happen. Each time it happens, the intensity increases. More people die. No amount of money you can borrow can afford you to build the type of infrastructure that you need to withstand these events. Imagine that. And then imagine if you could do something to stop it. That is where we're coming from.
I just wanted to add, not about the alleged comments that were made, but I think that the larger question is, is addressing climate change consistent with efforts in developing countries to grow and eradicate poverty? And I hope I'm not mischaracterizing your question. But the Secretary General has repeatedly said that sustainable development and climate change are two sides of the same coin. We cannot address climate change without addressing the economic growth and poverty eradication imperatives of developing countries. In a country like India, where 400 million persons are without access or don't have access to electricity, that must be taken into account when one looks at how India needs to address climate change and also provide reliable energy services to its citizens. However, conversely, development will not be sustainable and is not sustainable if climate change is not addressed. And this goes for all countries. So there is sometimes this notion that pursuing sustainable development, including economic growth and poverty eradication, is at variance with addressing climate change. In fact, the thinking has evolved over the course of the last few years. Two sides of the same coin, and they can be pursued simultaneously.
Thank you. We go to the next question from the audience.
Thank you very much. I'm David Hughes from Rutgers University. You said, Secretary Haynes, that Trinidad has nothing to give. Trinidad and Tobago has nothing to give in Paris, and I think there is something that your country could give. As you mentioned, it has a petrochemical and hydrocarbon industry. Last time I checked, Trinidad's per capita emissions were 28 metric tons, making it the 4th or 5th highest per capita emissions in the world. In Copenhagen, Prime Minister Manning rejected per capita emissions and said that's not relevant. I wonder if that will be the attitude of your government, the new government. I think it's an opportunity missed if so, because what Trinidad could give is leadership and say, we are a high per capita emissions country. We're going to commit to a very ambitious target, and we're going to challenge every other high emissions country, which includes the United States, for example, to do the same.
Thank you for the question. A few things. In my statement, when I said we had nothing to give, I meant in the political sense. right, in terms of the major issues. For example, the US very much needs China to participate in the agreement. If we do not participate, it doesn't really mean anything to many countries. However, I do take your point that it doesn't mean that we're coming to the table with empty hands. The government has taken a leadership position on climate change. Now, on the issue of per capita emissions, the fact remains that regardless of how you want to measure our carbon footprint, if Trinidad and Tobago disappeared tomorrow, it would make absolutely no difference to the level of global emissions in the atmosphere. None. Because like many other states, we still contribute less than 1% total of global emissions. Nevertheless, we have come forward with an INDC. We are one of the countries who have put forward, I would say, a moderately ambitious INDC. Could we do more? Yes, we can, but not in the present global environment where we are not sure whether the financing would be made available to do such. It's not feasible in the context of a very small country with a number of competing demands and a very, well, an economy that is not particularly diverse at this point in time, which is why we have made economic diversification one of our key development pillars over the next 10 to 15 years. In our INDC, we have targeted the most high-emitting sectors of the economy, transport and energy. We already produce 100% of our electricity from natural gas, which is still a fossil fuel energy, but it's still the cleanest one. And steps are underway to roll out renewable energy, to address even more emissions from the energy sector, but it is a slow process. So do we have something to give? Can we show leadership? Yes, we can show leadership, but we are still a very, very small country. So that leadership needs to be contextualized, and we have been taking, I would say, many actions in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now our next question.
Hi, I'm Lizzie from the Executive Intelligence Review, and I'd like to provide what my colleague was referring to, namely that leaders of the Green Movement, such as Schellenhuber, advisor to German government on climate, to Vatican, has said that we have to shut down all nuclear power and fossil fuel immediately with no transitional process, also in developing countries. Then you have somebody like Prince Philip, father of also Prince Charles, who's going to speak. And he said, in the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus to solve the problem of overpopulation. So there's certainly a political agenda behind this. And in terms of the science, you have scientists such as Svensmark, who is showing that in the past 500 million years, you actually don't have a coincidence between the temperature and CO2. So, you know, what about going with fusion as what China's doing, which is actually freeing people from poverty instead of population reduction, which is genocide? What about going for fusion, which will give the world a future?
Thank you for the comment. We'll, I think, move on. We take your the point on that. I think your colleague already asked the questions they addressed about the sustainable development, low carbon development being consistent with development goals. And, we're not going to answer for the sort of statements of other people that are not represented here. So thank you very much. Sorry, the other people are here, have their questions to ask, and we would like to give them the opportunity to ask about them too. Sorry, we have another question, or are there other people here?
Executive Intelligence Review or whatever it is, let other people participate in this conversation. Okay?
Hi, everyone. I am Aytekin from Azerbaijan. I'm leading the Enjoy Alliance Climate Change and Development. And it's interesting that when I interested about the climate change, it was the time Copenhagen failed. Before I was busy with research, HIV/AIDS, public health, and financing. And following the negotiations, it's very clear that negotiation between G77 and China and developed countries. And they have opposite view for everything: mitigation, adaptation, and also financing issue. About the INDC, however, my current research on INDC, how INDC will support countries to make domestic level climate change issue priority, and to make it include that in the national climate policy agenda. And USA, for example, against the INDCs to be included to agreement. And I guess in the Paris, INDC will get back the birth name in NDC without intended. And that, in that issue, in that case, how will go to the legally binding of the INDCs or agreement to the national levels. However, it's very good opportunity to have bottom-up approach and use the UNFCCC as umbrella to achieve these targets below the 2 degrees Celsius. Thank you.
You want to address Majid?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I understood that your question is what's the difference between, what will be the difference when we go from INDCs to NDCs, and I think that it's really just a term, in a way it's a terminology. So for many countries, the commitments that they've made today are probably what you'll see certainly in the next 5 years, and then countries based on that will, as we review or as we determine the review cycle, will determine how they can improve on that. And there's some discussion within the negotiations about backsliding, about whether you're always improving from your last best effort. And those are still some questions that will be determined, and so it's an interesting one. I think one of the things that I certainly note is, so for a country like the UAE, under the old regime, was not legally bound to take any particular action, but took the action anyway. So we have provided about $50 million fund for renewable energy in Pacific Islands, $350 million for renewable energy through the IRENA fund. We've also invested in policies at home that promote energy efficiency, water efficiency in our building codes, and a number of other policies that promote action domestically. But we've also invested in renewable energy. And the reason for that is because of our development strategy. So we recognize that we need to be a diversified economy, a mature economy that isn't based on one type of commodity, and recognized as part of that, so we're investing in a number of sectors in our economy, but also importantly recognized as part of that, that we're a provider of one type of energy today. Perhaps we could be a provider of the future type of energy in the future. And so that incentivized us as a country to take part in that. So when we thought about how do we turn this challenge into an opportunity, we thought about, well, how do we set in place the domestic policies that incentivize action? And so setting in place feed-in tariffs, set in place different types of policies that encourage the private sector and other partners to invest in technologies have led to this kind of investment in renewable energy technology, which could be the energy of the future. As a country domestically, we are strangely renewable energy resource poor. So we have solar power, but we don't really have hydro or wind or any other type of energy. So for us, an energy mix is something that's going to be important. But we recognize that we could be an exporter of renewable energy. So how can we develop the capacity at home to be delivering these technologies abroad? And that's why we've invested in these technologies, to diversify our economy. And so this comes back to this idea that Selwin and others have mentioned, is that sustainable development and climate change can be two sides of the same coin. So we can see opportunity in the challenge, and we can try to incentivize action that create new jobs, create green jobs or jobs in a new sector. And so it can be a positive story. And one of the great things about the climate and the planet is that it's all interconnected. So actions in one part of the world can help actions in another part. So we can invest globally, and that can have an effect globally. So to the point that was made about what can a small country do within its means, and of course every country is different, small countries can do things in other parts of the world that can help and have a significant impact.
Thank you very much, Majid. I see that we are a few minutes over time, so with that, I will thank our speakers and close the event. So thank you again to Majid Al Suwaidi, Selwin Hart, Rueanna Haynes, and Professor Michael Gerrard. I'll just note that some upcoming events for the Center on Global Energy Policy. Friday, November 20th, we have the U.S. Energy Outlook with Adam Semensky, Administrator of the EIA. Monday, November 30th, in the low faculty room, we have an expert panel discussion on the upcoming Venezuelan legislative elections and their aftermath. Tuesday, December 1st at Faculty House, we have the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook with IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol. And Monday, December 7th at Faculty House, we have a program on the Water Energy Nexus with Melanie Kenderdine, Director, Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis at the U.S. Department of Energy. Thank you all very much for your participation. Again, I was Keith Benish at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and we will look for the positive outcome in Paris in 2 weeks. Thank you very much all.